Okay, this is a video to kind of walk you through to some degree, and not entirely at all, close reading using form on a poem, which you have 1,000 words to do. Which again, I want to stress it's a relatively short amount, and I'm going to try to walk you through it as best I can in 10 minutes. Which means, of course, I'm not going to get anywhere near done. If you've sat through any of my classes, which you all have, it takes me 3 hours to get through a whole poem. But I can at least show you some of the techniques. Before I begin, though, I want to remind you that in that Robert Pinsky collection, The Sounds of Poetry, which I have here, there are a number of the pages that we read as a group that I really feel like go into some close reading moments that are as well done as anything I've ever read. So if you need some reminders about what that is, you can definitely look at page 17 and 18, really gets into that very as well does page 21. There's a very good paragraph about that. Point being, there are examples of it there as well. But I'm going to be using instead James Merrill's The Book of Ephraim, and I'm going to be looking at the section W on this one. Now, and I'm going to talk about some of the different elements of this that I feel like stand out to me and that I can discuss. And I'm going to try to walk my way through a few of the different things and see where my eye takes me. So before that happens, my apologies, let me turn off my notifications. Before that happens, one of the things that I want to think about here is my call for paper. Now, the call for paper that I've been using for this has been the one about hope. How does hope operate inside of a text? Why is hope important? So I'm just trying to think about hope as my scene that I'm looking through, right? With everything in my lens, really. So I did a little bit of research on hope, and if I can, I'll try to share my screen with you real quick. It's not like a super interesting thing to look at, but there is a space for this one. My apologies. That's not really going to help us very much. So I'll just talk you through it. One of the research I did was an anthropology and philosophy collection, a book, what they call existential anthropology. Yeah. So what it basically means is like to look at the history of humanity through the way humanity exists and thinks about the self. And one article that was in there, one chapter that was in there, was discussing the role of hope and what hope is. And the way they discussed it was a gap, right? So hope is a kind of gap. So we have hope as humanity for a thing to happen, even though it never happens, and existence suggests that it won't, right? But we still feel a sense of an entitlement toward hope. So the chapter goes on, and it's fascinating, and it's a super interesting read just for doing it. But I think that I'm going to keep this idea of gap and entitlement. It's kind of my controlling ideas right now, and I'm writing those down as I go because I'm looking for anything that sounds like that when I'm reading this book, because that's going to help me prove a thesis. And I don't have a thesis yet. Let me be really clear with you. I don't have a thesis yet. But I have an idea, and so I'm going to work toward that one. So section W actually begins in media res, meaning it starts in the middle of something, and it's actually, you have to go back to the previous section in V, where we're in Venice, and he's looking around, seeing the space, kind of being thrown off by this when he says at the end, her least stone, pure menace at the heart, at length became a window, fiery mild, whose walked through frame everything else at sunset hinged upon. And he ends on an M dash. So that's a good example of close reading right there, to think about M dashes and how M dashes work. So when I'm looking at punctuation, I know that I'm paying close attention to something. So an M dash basically means a quick jump into a new thought, all right, as opposed to a hyphen, which combines two words to create a single one, or a caring, I believe is what that's called, or kinning, that'd be a kinning. And then and an M dash, though, is about a sudden change of thought while you're having one, right? That's what that suggests. So he ends one section, section V, on a thought that shoots us straight into section W. So it begins in a place of time. The first word of this is when in the flashing pink and golden calm appears a youth. All right, now you can even hear the rhythm in that, right? When in the flashing pink and golden calm appears a youth to mount the bridge's stairs. His pack and staff betoken those who come from far off, as do sunburnt forehead. So these are the opening two sentences. Now, what's interesting to me to begin with this is that at the very beginning, we have this, we can hear it as iambic, when in the flashing pink and golden calm appears a youth to mount the bridge's stairs, right? So then in the third line, his pack and staff betoken those who come from far off, as do sunburnt forehead, hairs long, thicket, merman, blonde, the sparkling blue gaze, which remembrance deep in mind compares with one met in some other sphere, but who, where, when. So the rhythm in this poem, right, the meter, it changes from the contractual iambic pentameter at the beginning, which is to say that everything is clear, everything makes sense, when in the flashing pink and golden calm. So his movement from the M dash into this one is actually an interesting movement where he's going to rescue the meter, okay? And this, I think, is a kind of hope, right? Meter as hope. And what do I mean by that? I mean that meter in and of itself is an attempt to control. We can consider it one thing like a control narrative, right? And interestingly enough, the poem W is actually a narrative. And so that you understand it, during this time, uh, Jim's, Jim, his nephew, Betsy's son, has arrived in Venice, and they've somewhat serendipitously met in this space, and they go out to dinner together, and they wine and they dine, and we find out that Wendell, his nephew, is an amazing artist, a portraiture, and a portraitist, and he's basically, but he has a real sad look of humanity. He's about 18 years old. He's a bit misanthropic, finds this to be problematic, and eventually they separate and they go their different ways. And Merrill begins to think about this. And there's a lot of this just stuff in content there that seems interesting to me in terms of hope. For instance, in an earlier section where he's talking with his psychoanalyst, Jim is, the psychoanalyst basically brings up the idea, floats this notion that pretty much that David Jackson and James Merrill invented Ephraim because they can't have children, right? Or I mean, not that they can't have children, but their sexuality, right, precludes the fact of pregnancy. So they've kind of invented these narratives, right? To what do you do when you don't have a family, when you don't have progeny? What can happen? What can be created from that space? So it's interesting to me in this space that he's got his nephew here, right, where he like tries to very much, I think, move away from just being an uncle and try to be a father figure, try to help in this regard. And I think that's a kind of hope that the book shows us. But we see the gap, right? Is that he isn't his son. In fact, the poem ends, right? And that's it. That's the last time we see him in this book, because that's it. You're not entitled. He feels entitled to that hope. Merrill does. The speaker of the poems do. So that's interesting to me already, just in terms of content deals with hope. But meter itself is, again, an attempt to create a narrative, to control it, to say that I am taking all of the language, which is pure chaos in and of itself, and just if it's out there on its own, and instead I am going to manipulate it into sense, and more than just sense, which is what we do with syntax, diction, everything that we talk about always, but more than just sense, but a regulated, metered sense. I'm going to make it sound the way I want it to sound, because then, well, what, right? What do we put in that blank? Well, then I'm in control, right? Then I have control. And if I have control, then I'm happy, right? That's the theory. That's the hope. But we know that's not true because we have no control. And we never, but we have hope, right? And I think that's really interesting. This is the dynamic that I'm dealing with this. And this is all set on time. Now, the other thing that I noticed about this particular poem, and I'm just going to show it to you. If you have yours, you can see it, right? It's written in tercets. In fact, one quick look here off to the side, we're going to see that it's actually written in what we call terza rima, which is a specific Italian form, which makes sense because the poem is set in Venice, which is, of course, in Italy. But interestingly enough, it's also the same form that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in, and of course he shows up all throughout the text, but most notably at the beginning from Paradiso. And so I got a lot of things going on. Now, when I have terza rima, what that means is that I'm going to have a rhyme that's going to be showing up. And the way terza rima works is it goes ABA, BCB, CDC. So what you do is you tuck the middle line, line 2 of every stanza becomes the rhyme sounds of lines 1 and 3 of the preceding stanzas. And so they kind of, they blend, they thread into this, right? So I have these other ideas that are operating with this one. And anytime I have rhyme, I can always pull out my rhyme words as a way to look at close reading, right? With form, because that's what rhyme does. So I can think about full rhyme, half rhyme, and I can keep an eye out as I'm reading where do they not quite connect? Where are they off? Where's the gap of the rhyme, right? And that might be a really successful one for me because a lot of these rhymes really work very well. And when I read through it just a few minutes ago, I noticed a few that aren't, right? Confesses and forfaces is an example. That's the 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the 5th stanza down. So we've already had a kind of play against that one. And there are, of course, more, but a lot of these are pretty strongly on point. and they do an interesting way of doing that. There was one I wanted to see. Spitting fire at us rhymes later with nonplussed and omnivorous, which is a very good rhyme, but they're complicated words, so I might spend some time with those as well. But point is, it's been about 10 minutes, so I don't want to take too much time beyond this one. But my first attempt with this one would be to say, okay, I'm looking for gaps, because gaps are a part of hope. So where do I see gaps? Where do I see hope? Okay, well, I first see gaps in stanza breaks. In and of themselves, it is using gaps. It is utilizing blank space to create separate narratives. And I'm seeing meter that's an attempt to control, right? To have control. And I can see it even by the really by the fourth line, and then all throughout the rest of them, that he's playing with meter. It's varying because he can't keep it in control. Because if you only have controlled meter, right, when you're controlling it, you have nothing interesting. It's not exciting. Therefore, there's this argument to be made, I think, as well, that might help me understand my later poem, my later paper, to understand that in fact we need to not have our hope met, because then what would we do? Right? There's no joy in that as we go forward. So that kind of gives you a starting point for the first 10 minutes of this video. I'll come back in a little bit later, and I will attempt to show you like some specific elements that I can pull out with meter, but hopefully that gives you the beginning of a place to start with your own. So please feel free to email me if you found this to be unhelpful, or you need more clarity, or you want to just say hi.